The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Richard Sterling, the real estate mogul of Seattle, was leaning back in his chair, actually laughing. He looked at his wife, Sarah, sitting alone at the plaintiff's table. No lawyer, no assistants, just a trembling woman in a thrift store cardigan holding a single manila envelope. Richard whispered to his high-priced attorney, "Watch this. She's going to beg for a settlement." But the laughter died instantly when Judge Harrison Caldwell opened that envelope. The judge's face went pale. He looked over his glasses, stared directly at Richard, and asked, "Mr. Sterling, are you aware of whose name is actually on the deed to the Shellhurst estate?" That was the moment Richard realized. The game was over. Richard Sterling didn't just walk into a room. He owned it. Standing 6'2" in a bespoke Italian suit tailored on Savile Row, he checked his reflection in the glass windows of his corner office on the 40th floor of the Sterling Dynamics building. Below him, the city of Seattle looked like a circuit board of gray and rain, moving at his command. "Richard, the board is waiting," a voice purred from the intercom. It was Jessica Thorne, his chief financial officer, and for the last 18 months, the woman currently warming his bed while his wife, Sarah, sat at home collecting dust. "Tell them I'm coming, Jessica, and make sure the merger documents for the warehouse district are on top. I want to crush the union reps before lunch." Richard smirked. Life was easy when you had no conscience. He was 45, richer than God, and about to close a deal that would hide $30 million of assets in an offshore account in the Caymans, assets his wife would never know existed. Sarah. The thought of her made him roll his eyes. When they had met 15 years ago, she was a shy, pretty librarian named Sarah Miller. She was sweet, unassuming, and looked at him like he was a superhero. He had liked that. He wanted a fan, not a partner. But over the years, sweet had turned into boring. She wore sensible shoes. She volunteered at the animal shelter. She cooked pot roast on Tuesdays. She had no idea that Richard had outgrown her the moment his net worth hit 7 figures. He walked into the boardroom. The air smelled of expensive coffee and fear. "Gentlemen," Richard announced, taking his seat at the head of the mahogany table. "Let's make some money." Arthur Vance, Richard's personal attorney and fixer, leaned in. Arthur was a shark in a human suit, bald, sharp-nosed, and utterly ruthless. "Richard, before we start, did you receive the certified mail at the house this morning?" Richard waved a hand dismissively. "Probably just another charity gala invite for Sarah. She loves wasting my money on saving 3-legged dogs." "It was from the courthouse, Richard," Arthur said, his voice low. Richard paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "The courthouse?" "Domestic relations. Sarah filed for divorce." The room went silent. Richard stared at Arthur for a second, and then a loud, barking laugh erupted from his chest. The board members looked around, confused, before nervously chuckling along with the boss. "Divorce?" Richard wiped a tear of mirth from his eye. "Sarah. My Sarah. She can't even return a blender to Target without getting anxiety. Who is representing her? Is it Myers? Goldberg?" Arthur hesitated, checking his tablet. "That's the thing, Richard. The docket says Pro C. She's representing herself." Richard slammed his hand on the table, grinning. "She's representing herself. Oh, this is rich. This is beautiful. She thinks she can walk into a superior court against us. She doesn't even know how to fill out a financial affidavit." "It might be a ploy," Jessica said from the other end of the table, her eyes narrowing. She was smarter than Richard gave her credit for, and unlike him, she didn't underestimate people. Maybe she's trying to garner sympathy from a judge. Sympathy doesn't split assets, Jessica, Richard sneered. Lawyers do. And I have Arthur Vance. He turned to his lawyer. Arthur, bury her. Drag it out. Make her spend every penny she has, which is nothing because I control the accounts. By the time we're done, she'll be begging to keep her 2015 Honda Civic. Richard stood up, buttoning his jacket. The fear was gone, replaced by the thrill of the hunt. He loved crushing competitors in business. Crushing his wife in court would just be a warm-up exercise. Let's get back to the merger, Richard said. I have a wife to bankrupt later. But Richard made a critical error that morning. He assumed Sarah was the same woman he had married 15 years ago. He didn't realize that living with a narcissist for a decade and a half changes a person. It either breaks them, or it turns them into something harder, sharper, and much quieter. Sarah hadn't just been cooking pot roast. She had been watching, and she knew about the Cayman accounts. She knew about Jessica, and most importantly, she knew the one name that Richard Sterling was terrified of, a name he thought was buried in a grave in 1998. 3 weeks prior to the filing, the atmosphere in the Sterling mansion at 42 Oakhaven Drive was suffocating. The house was a sprawling modern masterpiece of glass and steel, cold and echoey. Sarah Sterling sat at the kitchen island, staring at a cup of herbal tea that had gone cold. At 40, she was still beautiful, though she hid it under baggy sweaters and tied her brown hair back in a severe bun. She looked at the clock. 8:15 p.m. Richard wasn't home. He wouldn't be home. Working late? He had texted. Sarah knew working late meant dinner at Le Cavalier with Jessica Thorne. She knew because she had the password to Richard's Uber Eats account. He was sloppy with his digital footprint because he thought Sarah was technologically illiterate. He thought she only used the iPad for Pinterest recipes. He was wrong. Sarah stood up and walked to the study. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the night. Every Tuesday, Richard played poker with the partners. Jessica went to her spin class. This was the only window she had. She entered Richard's home office. It smelled of leather and sandalwood, the scent of his cologne. She hated it. She went straight to the large oil painting of a storm-tossed ship hanging behind his desk. It was a cliché, really, the hidden safe behind the painting. Richard wasn't as original as he thought. She gripped the frame and swung it outward. There it was, a heavy titanium safe. She didn't have the code, but she didn't need it. 6 months ago, she had come into the office to bring Richard a coffee while he was on a call. He had his back turned, opening the safe. He punched in the numbers, 102488. It wasn't a birthday. It wasn't an anniversary. It was the stock price of his first company on the day he sold it. 1024,088. Richard loved money more than people. Of course, his passcode was a dollar amount. Sarah's fingers trembled as she punched the keypad. Beep, 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 beep. A green light flashed. The mechanical clunk of the lock disengaging sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. She pulled the heavy door open. Inside were stacks of cash, a few watches, and a passport. Sarah ignored the cash. She reached for the black leather binder at the back. This was the Doomsday Book. Richard had bragged about it once when he was drunk on scotch. If the IRS ever comes for me, Sarah, this book is my insurance policy. But they'll never find it. She opened the binder. It was full of incorporation papers for shell companies. Obsidian Holdings, Blue Water LLC, Titan Trust. She flipped through the pages frantically. She needed proof of the Cayman transfer. If she divorced him without proof, the court would only split the known assets. Richard would keep the millions he had siphoned off, and she would be left with a pittance. Her finger traced down a ledger. Transfer, $4.5 million. Beneficiary, J. Thorne. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. He was giving their marital assets to his mistress. She kept flipping. Then she stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat. There was a deed for a massive commercial property development in downtown Seattle, the Skyline Project. It was Richard's crown jewel, worth nearly $50 million. But Richard had structured it strangely to avoid taxes. He had put the ownership of the land into a blind trust called the Phoenix Trust. Sarah read the fine print of the trust document. Her eyes widened. She read it again. Richard had been lazy. He had used an old legal template from when they first got married, back when he was trying to impress her father, a stern man who didn't trust Richard. To appease her father back then, Richard had listed the primary beneficiary of the trust not as himself, but as the biological heir of the Miller family line. He had never updated it. He thought he controlled the trust because he was the trustee, but the ownership, the equity, belonged to the beneficiary. And then, stuck to the back of the deed, was a handwritten note on a yellow sticky note in Richard's handwriting. Hide the asset here. Judge Caldwell never checks the beneficiary on blind trusts. He owes me a favor. Sarah pulled out her phone. She didn't take a picture. Pictures could be disputed. Pictures could be photoshopped. She took the original deed. She replaced it with a dummy document she had typed up earlier that day. A fake deed that looked identical at a glance, but listed Richard as the owner. She placed the fake in the binder, closed it, and put it back in the safe. She locked the safe. She moved the painting back. She stood in the center of the room, clutching the document to her chest. "You want a war, Richard?" she whispered to the empty room. "I'll give you a war, but I won't use a lawyer you can buy. I'm going to do this myself." She knew that if she hired a high-profile lawyer, Richard would get spooked. He would check the safe. He would destroy the documents. He would hide the money better. She had to look weak. She had to look incompetent. She had to make him laugh. Because when Richard laughed, he closed his eyes. And that's when she would strike. The mandatory mediation took place 10 days later at the offices of Vance, Galloway and Moore, a law firm that occupied the top 3 floors of the Columbia Center. The view from the conference room was breathtaking, overlooking the Puget Sound, but Sarah didn't look out the window. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the polished grain of the walnut table. She wore a grey cardigan that had seen better days, and a pair of trousers that were slightly too loose. She carried a canvas tote bag instead of a briefcase. Inside were her notes, handwritten on lined notebook paper. Across from her sat Richard and Arthur Vance. They looked like twin pillars of corporate invincibility. Richard was checking his watch, a distinct air of boredom radiating off him. The mediator, a stern woman named Elaine Pembroke, who had seen 1,000 divorces and lost her faith in love somewhere around 1995, cleared her throat. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Sterling," Elaine began, adjusting her spectacles. "The purpose of this meeting is to reach an amicable settlement before we burden the court system. Mr. Sterling's counsel has prepared a proposal. Mr. Vance?" Arthur Vance slid a sleek, leather-bound folder across the table towards Sarah. It moved smoothly, like a shark gliding through water. "Sarah," Arthur said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Richard wants to be generous. He knows you haven't worked in, well, a decade and a half. The job market is tough. So here is the offer." Sarah opened the folder. The numbers were insulting. Alimony, $2,500 per month for 3 years. Asset division. Sarah retains the 2015 Honda Civic. Richard retains the Oakhaven estate, the vehicles, and all stock portfolios. Lump sum payout, $50,000. $50,000. That was less than Richard spent on his country club membership fees annually. It wouldn't even cover rent in Seattle for 2 years. "This is..." Sarah's voice trembled. She looked up, her eyes wide and watery. "This doesn't seem right. The house alone is worth $4 million. Richard sighed, a heavy, exaggerated sound. He leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Sarah, look at me. The house is leveraged. It's mortgaged to the hilt to pay for the business. If we sell it, we owe the bank money. I'm doing you a favor by taking on that debt. You walk away clean with 50 grand. You can move back to wherever your parents live. Idaho? Montana? Wyoming, Sarah whispered. Right, Wyoming. You can buy a nice little trailer there, Richard smirked. But, Sarah flipped through the pages with clumsy fingers. What about the other companies? Obsidian Holdings, the accounts at Meridian Shelter Bank? The air in the room froze. Arthur Vance's eyes snapped to Richard. Richard's face remained impassive, but his jaw muscle twitched, a tiny, rhythmic spasm. I don't know where you're getting your information, Sarah, Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. Obsidian Holdings is a defunct shell company from a failed venture 10 years ago. It has zero value. And Meridian Shelter? Richard doesn't bank there. I thought I saw a letter once, Sarah stammered, pulling back, looking terrified that she had upset them. Maybe I was wrong. I'm not very good with financial papers. Richard relaxed. She was guessing. She was fishing. She didn't know. If she had real evidence, she would have a lawyer slamming it on the table. The fact that she was here alone, mumbling about old letters, meant she was clueless. You're confused, Sarah, Richard said, his tone patronizing. This is why you need to take the deal. If we go to court, Arthur is going to depose you. He's going to make you stand in front of a judge and explain why you contributed nothing to the marriage for 15 years. The judge might give you zero. Is that what you want? Sarah looked down at her canvas bag. She gripped the handles tight. I can't take this deal, Richard. I need half. Richard threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, barking sound that echoed off the glass walls. Half? You think you deserve half of my empire because you vacuumed the rugs? Arthur, we're done here. File the motion for a trial date. She wants to play the victim? Fine. We'll let Judge Caldwell decide. Richard stood up, buttoning his jacket. He leaned over the table, his expensive cologne washing over Sarah. You're making a mistake, Sarah. A very expensive mistake. When this is over, you won't even have the Honda. He walked out, Arthur trailing behind him like a loyal Doberman. Sarah sat there for a long time after they left. The mediator, Elaine, looked at her with pity. Mrs. Sterling, Elaine said softly, you are pro se. That means you are your own lawyer. Arthur Vance is one of the most aggressive litigators in the state. Are you sure you don't want to reconsider the settlement? It's better than nothing. Sarah finally looked up. The tears were gone. Her eyes were dry, clear, and cold as ice. "I don't want nothing, Elaine," Sarah said, her voice steady and completely different from the trembling woman of 5 minutes ago. "I want everything." She stood up, picked up her canvas bag and walked out. She had what she needed. She had confirmed that Obsidian Holdings and Meridian Shelter Bank were the pressure points. Richard's reaction, that tiny jaw twitch, told her she was right on target. He had lied about them being defunct. Now, she just had to get him to say that lie, under oath. The Superior Court of King County was a place of misery, boredom, and fluorescent lighting. Courtroom 4B was presided over by Judge Harrison Caldwell. Judge Caldwell was a man of the Old Boys Club. He had a silver mane of hair, a face red from too much scotch, and a reputation for hating long divorce trials. He and Richard Sterling were members of the same exclusive golf club, the Pines. While they weren't close friends, they moved in the same circles. They nodded to each other in the locker room. That familiarity was dangerous. The courtroom was packed. Richard's public relations team had leaked the divorce to the press, spinning it as a gold digger trying to fleece a local job creator. A few reporters sat in the back, pens poised. Richard sat at the defendant's table, flanked by Arthur Vance and 2 junior associates. They had laptops, stacks of binders, and charts. They looked like they were launching a military invasion. Sarah sat alone at the plaintiff's table. Her table was empty, except for a notepad, a pen, and the manila envelope. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Caldwell swept in, his black robes billowing. He sat down, rubbed his temples, and glared at the docket. "Sterling versus Sterling," the judge grumbled. "I see the plaintiff is representing herself. Mrs. Sterling, I will warn you now. I do not offer special treatment to pro se litigants. You are expected to know the rules of evidence and procedure. If you waste my time, I will hold you in contempt. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said softly, standing up. "Very well. Mr. Vance, opening statement." Arthur Vance stood up. He was in his element. He strode around the courtroom, gesturing eloquently. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. Richard Sterling is a self-made man. He built Sterling Dynamics from the ground up. He worked 80-hour weeks. His wife, the plaintiff, enjoyed the fruits of that labor without contributing to the harvest. Now, she seeks to destroy the very business that sustains hundreds of employees in this city, all out of greed. We will show that the assets she claims exist are fantasies, and that the prenuptial agreement, though missing, was understood verbally. We ask that the court grant a fair separation of assets based on contribution, and in this case her contribution was 0. He sat down, looking smug. Richard gave him a subtle nod. "Mrs. Sterling?" The judge looked at her, bored. "Your opening?" Sarah stood up. Her hands were shaking visibly. She looked at the judge, then at Richard. "Your Honor," she began, her voice wavering. "My husband is a powerful man. He is smart. He is successful. I am just a housewife. But I know one thing. I know what a lie sounds like. And I am asking the court to simply look at the truth, not the fancy charts, not the expensive words, just the truth. I believe my husband has hidden millions of dollars from this family, and I intend to prove it." Arthur Vance chuckled audibly. The judge frowned at Sarah. "Allegations require proof, Mrs. Sterling, not feelings. Call your first witness." I call Richard Sterling to the stand, Sarah said. A murmur went through the courtroom. It was risky to call the hostile party first. Richard walked to the witness stand, took the oath, and sat down. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of amusement and pity. He was ready to destroy her. Sarah walked to the podium. She looked small. "Richard," she said, "do you love me?" "Objection," Arthur Vance barked. "Relevance?" "Sustained," Judge Caldwell sighed. "Mrs. Sterling, stick to the finances." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. She looked down at her notes. "Richard, can you tell the court the total value of your assets as of today?" Richard smiled. He had rehearsed this. "Approximately $4.2 million, mostly tied up in the primary residence and illiquid stocks in Sterling Dynamics." "And you have no other bank accounts? No other properties?" "None," Richard said smoothly. "I am an open book, Sarah. You know that." "What about Obsidian Holdings?" Sarah asked. Richard didn't blink. "As my lawyer stated, that company was dissolved years ago. It has a balance of 0. And the Phoenix Trust?" This time, Richard paused, just for a fraction of a second. The Phoenix Trust was the vehicle for the Skyline project. It was the big secret. But he knew the paperwork was impenetrable. His name wasn't on it. "I serve as a trustee for that trust," Richard said carefully. "I manage it for a third party. I do not own it. Therefore, it is not a marital asset." "Who is the third party?" Sarah asked. "It is a blind trust," Richard lied. "I manage the assets for anonymous investors." Sarah nodded slowly. She looked defeated. "So you don't own the Skyline project land? The land worth $50 million? "I do not," Richard stated firmly. "I merely manage the development." "And you have no offshore accounts, specifically in the Cayman Islands?" "Absolutely not," Richard said, sounding offended. "That is a ridiculous accusation." Sarah turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I have no more questions for the witness at this time. But I would like to submit evidence to impeach this testimony." Arthur Vance stood up. "Objection. We haven't seen any evidence. Discovery closed weeks ago." "It is impeachment evidence, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice suddenly gaining a steel edge. "Newly discovered. Under State v. Reynolds, impeachment evidence regarding perjury can be introduced at any time." Judge Caldwell looked annoyed. He looked at the clock. It was almost lunch. "Fine," the judge snapped. "What do you have, Mrs. Sterling? Make it quick." Sarah picked up the manila envelope. She walked toward the bench. Richard watched her. He felt a sudden, cold prickle on the back of his neck. There was something about the way she was walking, not like a scared housewife anymore. She walked with the precision of an executioner. She handed the envelope to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. "This envelope," Sarah announced to the room, turning to face Richard directly, "contains the original deed to the Skyline project property, held by the Phoenix Trust. It also contains the ledger from the safe in our home, the safe Richard thinks I don't know the combination to." Richard's face went white. He started to stand up. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Judge Caldwell barked. The judge opened the envelope. He pulled out the deed. He adjusted his glasses. The room went silent. Richard's mind was racing. "It doesn't matter," he thought. "The Phoenix Trust beneficiary is a shell company. She can't prove it's me. I'm safe." Judge Caldwell read the document. His eyebrows shot up. He squinted. He read it again. Then the judge looked up. He wasn't looking at Sarah. He was staring at Richard with an expression of utter shock and confusion. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice quiet but echoing in the silent room. Are you aware of the beneficiary designation on this trust instrument? It's a holding company, Your Honor, Richard stammered, sweat breaking out on his forehead. No, Judge Caldwell said. It is not a holding company. The judge turned the document around so the court could see. He pointed to the line at the bottom, the one Richard hadn't checked in 15 years. The beneficiary of the Phoenix Trust, and by extension, the owner of the $50 million Skyline project, is listed as the firstborn child of Sarah Miller. Richard froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he nearly fainted. He remembered now. 15 years ago, he had been trying to impress Sarah's father. He had written it that way to show he was a family man, intending to change it the week after the wedding. He had forgotten. He had never changed it. And Sarah and he didn't have any children. Wait, Richard whispered, his voice cracking. We don't have children. So the trust is invalid. It reverts to the trustee. It reverts to me. Richard smiled nervously. See? It's a technicality. There is no firstborn child. Sarah stood in the middle of the courtroom. She smoothed her cardigan. She looked at Richard, and for the first time in years, she smiled. A real, genuine, terrifying smile. Actually, Your Honor, Sarah said, her hand resting on her stomach. That's not entirely true. The silence in courtroom 4B was no longer just quiet. It was heavy, suffocating, like the air before a tornado touches down. Richard Sterling was gripping the railing of the witness stand so hard his knuckles were white. "What did you say?" he hissed, abandoning all pretense of courtroom decorum. Sarah didn't look at him. She looked at the gallery, toward the back row where a young man in a hooded sweatshirt had been sitting silently since the trial began. He had his head down, scrolling on his phone, looking like a bored law student or a random drifter escaping the rain. "I said," Sarah repeated, her voice gaining strength with every syllable, "that the beneficiary condition has been met. There is a firstborn child of the Miller line." She gestured to the back of the room. "Daniel, please stand up." The young man in the back row stood. He lowered his hood. He was tall, with the same chestnut hair as Sarah and a jawline that was sharp and defiant. He looked to be about 19 years old. He wore a cheap flannel shirt and jeans, a stark contrast to the Italian wool suits at the defense table. But his eyes were burning with a mixture of anger and protective fire as he looked at Sarah. Richard stared. He blinked, trying to process the visual information. He looked from Sarah to the boy, and back to Sarah. "Who is this?" Richard demanded, his voice rising to a shout. "Who the hell is this?" "This is Daniel Miller," Sarah said calmly. "My son." Arthur Vance, realizing the ship was sinking, jumped up. "Objection! This is ambush tactics. There is no record of a child. We have tax returns for 15 years. No dependents listed." "I didn't list him," Sarah said, turning back to the judge, "because Richard told me on our second date that he despised children. He said they were parasites. He said he would never marry a woman who came with baggage. So, I made a choice." Tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of old, resolved guilt. "I was 21 when I had Daniel. I was young, scared, and broke. When I met Richard, I saw a way out. I saw a life of safety. So I left Daniel with my sister in Wyoming. I sent money every month. Cash I scraped from the grocery budget. Cash I stole from your wallet, Richard. I visited him under the guise of visiting my sick aunt. I lived a lie for 15 years to keep my son safe from your judgment and to keep myself in your world. It was the greatest sin of my life. But today I make it right." She pointed a shaking finger at the deed on the judge's desk. "You wrote that trust to fool my father, Richard. You thought you were so smart, using a generic template. The firstborn child of Sarah Miller. You didn't specify born within the marriage. You didn't specify legitimate. You just wrote child. Daniel is my child. He is the beneficiary, the Skyline Project. It belongs to him." Richard looked like he was having a stroke. The veins in his neck bulged. The math was hitting him like a freight train. The Skyline Project was worth $50 million. If the trust was valid, he didn't own the land his biggest development was built on. He had been building a castle on a teenager's lawn. "This is fraud!" Richard screamed, pointing at the boy. "She's hiring actors. That kid isn't hers. I want a DNA test. I want a paternity test." The young man, Daniel, spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, rough, and echoed through the room. "I don't need a test to know who my mother is," Daniel said, walking past the bar and approaching the plaintiff's table. He stood next to Sarah, towering over her, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "But I'm happy to give you a DNA sample, Mr. Sterling. I'm also happy to accept the rent checks you owe me for the last 10 years of using my land." The courtroom erupted. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. The stenographer's fingers were flying. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel, but there was no force behind it. He was staring at the documents in front of him, his face pale. He was looking at the sticky note attached to the back of the deed. The note Sarah had mentioned earlier, but hadn't read aloud yet. The note that implicated him. The chaos in the courtroom settled into a tense, vibrating hum as Judge Caldwell held up his hand. "Order," Caldwell said. His voice was dangerously low. "Everyone sit down. Now." Richard slumped back into his chair, breathing heavily. Arthur Vance was furiously whispering into his ear, likely telling him to shut up, but Richard looked manic. He was a man who had never lost, and he didn't know how to process the sensation of the ground crumbling beneath him. Judge Caldwell slowly peeled the yellow sticky note off the back of the deed. He held it up to the light. "Mrs. Sterling," the judge said, his eyes hard behind his spectacles. "You submitted this envelope into evidence. Are you aware of what is written on this note attached to the deed?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said. She was holding Daniel's hand tight. "I recognize my husband's handwriting." "Read it for the record, Your Honor," Richard shouted, thinking he saw an opening. "Read it. It probably proves she stole it." Judge Caldwell looked at Richard with a gaze that could have frozen magma. He was a proud man, a man who valued his reputation above all else, and Richard Sterling, in his arrogance, had threatened that reputation. "Oh, I will read it, Mr. Sterling," the judge said. He adjusted his glasses and read the scrawled note aloud, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Hide the asset here. Judge Caldwell never checks the beneficiary on blind trusts. He owes me a favor." The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur Vance closed his eyes and put his head in his hands. He knew it was over. Richard's mouth fell open. He had forgotten the note. He had written it 5 years ago, when he moved the deed into the safe, a mental reminder to himself of why the asset was safe. He had been drunk on power, assuming that his casual acquaintance with the judge at the country club translated to judicial immunity. Judge Caldwell's face turned a deep, terrifying shade of crimson. "Miss Sterling," the judge began, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Do you imply, in writing, that this court is corrupt? Do you imply that I, a superior court judge, am in your pocket?" No, no, Your Honor. Richard scrambled up, his hands shaking. It was a figure of speech. I meant we are friends. From the club. We are not friends, Caldwell roared, slamming his hand on the bench. I am a servant of the law, and you are a litigant who apparently believes he can buy justice. The judge looked at the bailiff. Bailiff, secure the courtroom doors. No one leaves. Caldwell turned his glare back to the defense table. Mr. Vance, your client has just admitted to hiding assets in a blind trust to defraud his wife, and has implicated this court in his scheme. This triggers an immediate forensic audit of all Sterling Dynamics holdings. Your Honor, please, Arthur Vance begged, standing up. My client is under extreme stress. The note is hearsay. It's undated. It is attached to a certified deed, Caldwell snapped. And now I am forced to recuse myself from this case to avoid the appearance of impropriety. But before I do, I am issuing a temporary freezing order. All assets held by Richard Sterling, Sterling Dynamics, and the Phoenix Trust are frozen effective immediately. No money moves. No accounts are accessed. Not a dime. You can't do that, Richard shrieked. I have payroll on Friday. I have the merger. You should have thought of that before you decided I owed you a favor, Caldwell said icily. Furthermore, regarding the Phoenix Trust, based on the plain language of the document, the beneficiary is clear. Pending DNA confirmation, the beneficial ownership of the Skyline property resides with Daniel Miller. Caldwell looked at Sarah. His expression softened, just a fraction. He respected a good trap, even if he had been the bait. Mrs. Sterling, you have played your hand well, but this court cannot proceed with me on the bench. I am declaring a mistrial. A new judge will be assigned for the asset division. However, he paused, looking at the panic in Richard's eyes. I am forwarding the transcript of today's hearing, along with this sticky note, to the district attorney's office. There are questions of tax evasion, fraud, and perjury here that go beyond divorce court. The gavel came down with the sound of a gunshot. Court is adjourned. Richard stood frozen. The freezing order meant his credit cards wouldn't work. His corporate accounts were locked. The merger he was supposed to sign this afternoon was dead. He looked across the aisle. Sarah was hugging her son. They looked like a fortress, impenetrable and real. Richard lunged. It happened in slow motion. He scrambled over the defense table, his face twisted into a mask of pure hate, reaching for Sarah's neck. You ruined me! You useless! Hey! Daniel stepped in front of his mother. He didn't hit Richard. He didn't have to. The two bailiffs were on Richard in a second. They tackled the billionaire to the floor. The sound of his expensive suit tearing was audible. Get off me! Do you know who I am? Richard screamed, his face pressed against the dirty courtroom carpet. Sarah looked down at him. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked like someone watching a bug struggle on its back. Yes, Richard, she said softly, loud enough for only him to hear. We know exactly who you are. You're the man who laughed. As the bailiffs dragged Richard out in handcuffs, not for the divorce, but for assaulting a litigant in open court, Sarah turned to Arthur Vance. The shark-like lawyer was packing his briefcase with frantic speed. He wanted to get as far away from Richard Sterling as possible. Mr. Vance, Sarah said. Arthur froze. Mrs. Sterling, I had no knowledge of the hidden assets. I will be withdrawing as counsel immediately. I'm sure you will, Sarah said coolly. But tell me something. Does the clean break offer still stand? Because I think the price just went up. Arthur swallowed hard, looked at the furious boy standing next to her, and shook his head. There is no offer, Sarah. You won. You just took the king off the board. The holding cell at the King County Correctional Facility smelled of industrial disinfectant and unwashed bodies. It was a smell that Richard Sterling, a man accustomed to the scent of aged leather and Davidoff cigars, found physically repulsive. He sat on a cold metal bench, still wearing his torn Italian suit. The expensive fabric was now dusty and rumpled, a perfect metaphor for his life. He had been permitted one phone call. He didn't call Sarah to beg. He didn't call Jessica for comfort. He called Arthur Vance. The call went straight to voicemail. You have reached the offices of Vance, Galloway, and Moore. If you are calling regarding the Sterling matter, please direct your inquiries to our Media Relations Department. Arthur Vance is no longer representing Mr. Sterling. Richard threw the receiver against the wall. The guard outside the cell didn't even flinch. Keep it down in there, billionaire. Bail hearing is in 2 hours. The freezing order Judge Caldwell had issued was absolute. Richard couldn't access his personal checking account to buy a candy bar from the vending machine, let alone post the $500,000 bail set by the night judge for the assault charge. He had to call his sister in Ohio, a school teacher he hadn't spoken to in 5 years, because she married a plumber. She had to put her modest house up as collateral to get him out. The humiliation was worse than the handcuffs. While Richard was breathing stale jail air, the pristine world of Sterling Dynamics was being dismantled by an army of forensic accountants appointed by the district attorney. Jessica Thorne stood in the middle of the chaos on the 40th floor. FBI agents in blue windbreakers were unplugging computers. Serious-looking men and women with boxes were emptying filing cabinets. The shredders were silent. The feds had cut the power cords first. Ms. Thorne, a stern-faced agent named Beatrice Rossi said, approaching Jessica. We need access to the Cayman intermediary server. The passwords you provided are incorrect. Jessica looked at the agent, then at her own reflection in the darkening window. She was 32 years old. She was smart, ambitious, and she had tied her star to Richard Sterling because he was a rocket ship. Now he was the Hindenburg. Jessica didn't hesitate. Survivors don't hesitate. The passwords I gave you were the ones Richard told me to use, Jessica lied smoothly. However, I kept a personal log of the actual keystrokes he used when he thought I wasn't looking. I have them on a flash drive in my purse, along with a record of the illegal wire transfers he forced me to authorize under duress. Agent Rossi raised an eyebrow. You're offering cooperation in exchange for immunity. I'm a victim here, Agent Rossi, Jessica said, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. Richard is a manipulator. I was just following orders to keep my job. She handed over the flash drive. It contained everything needed to bury Richard for 20 years on federal money laundering charges. Jessica had started compiling it 6 months ago, the moment Richard joked about trading her in for a newer model when she turned 35. By the time Richard made bail and stumbled out of the jail at 2:00 a.m., the rain soaking his ruined suit, he had nothing. His phone was blowing up with Google alerts. Sterling Empire collapses, billionaire assaults, wife in court, secret son inherits skyline project. He hailed a taxi. He didn't have cash. He had to offer the driver his Rolex just to get a ride to the Oakhaven mansion. When he arrived, the gate code didn't work. He climbed the fence, tearing his trousers. He ran to the front door, jamming his key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. The locks had been changed. A piece of paper was taped to the heavy oak door. It was a restraining order, effective immediately, barring him from coming within 500 feet of the marital residence or Sarah Sterling. Richard stood in the rain, staring at the house he had built to intimidate the world. It was dark, cold, and utterly locked against him. He sat down on the front step and did the only thing he had left. He put his head in his hands and wept. Miles away, in a brightly lit 24-hour diner, Sarah and Daniel sat across from each other in an orange vinyl booth. A plate of untouched French fries sat between them. It was awkward. 15 years of separation hung heavy in the air. "You look like your grandfather," Sarah said softly, stirring her coffee. Daniel didn't look at her. He was shredding a paper napkin. "He hated me too, didn't he? Because I wasn't legitimate." "He didn't hate you, Danny. He was old-fashioned, stubborn, like me." Sarah reached across the table, her hand hovering over his. "I am so sorry. Every day I was sorry. I thought I was protecting you from Richard's world. I thought if I just secured our future, I could bring you home and make it up to you." Daniel looked up. His eyes were hard, but the anger was cracking. "You chose him for 15 years, Mum. You chose his money over me." "No," Sarah said fiercely. "I chose survival. And then when I found that deed, I chose revenge. For both of us. I stayed to make sure that when I left, I burned his world down so completely he could never hurt anyone ever again. And I did it for you. The Skyline Project. It's yours. It's really yours. $50 million in equity. You never have to worry about anything again." Daniel looked at his mother. He saw the cheap cardigan, the tired lines around her eyes, the shaking hands. He saw the toll the last 15 years had taken on her. She hadn't been living in luxury. She had been living in a war zone. He slowly reached out and took a French fry. "So," Daniel said, his voice gruff, $50 million. Does this mean I can finally get a decent car instead of Aunt Marge's 2004 Subaru?" Sarah laughed. It was a real laugh, free and light, the first one in a decade. It sounded like wind chimes breaking the silence. "Yeah, kid," she smiled, tears leaking from her eyes again. "I think we can swing a new car." 6 months later. The divorce was finalized in record time, mostly because Richard had no money left to fight it. The forensic audit had been a bloodbath. The IRS, the SEC, and the FBI had descended on the carcass of Sterling Dynamics like vultures. Richard was currently under house arrest in a dreary, rented one-bedroom apartment near the airport, awaiting trial on 12 federal counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and perjury. His passport was revoked. His ankle monitor chafed. Sarah sat on the terrace of a penthouse condominium overlooking Elliott Bay. It wasn't a sprawling mansion. It was tasteful, modern, and full of light. She wore a tailored silk blouse and linen trousers, no more thrift store cardigans. Her hair was cut in a sharp, stylish bob. Across from her sat Mark Simmons, the lead forensic accountant appointed by the court to oversee the dissolution of the marital assets. "It's worse than we thought, Sarah," Mark said, closing a thick binder. "Richard wasn't just hiding money from you. He was running a Ponzi scheme to cover losses in the tech sector. The assets you received, the remaining liquid cash, the proceeds from the sale of the Oakhaven house, that's pretty much all there is. The creditors are fighting over scraps." "What about Jessica Thorne?" Sarah asked quietly, sipping an iced tea. Mark hesitated. "That's the interesting part. Ms. Thorne cut a deal for immunity. She provided the evidence that nailed Richard. But in the process of auditing the books, We found something else. For the last 18 months, Jessica had been siphoning off about $20,000 a month into her own private account. She was stealing from him long before the crash. Mark leaned in. The strange thing is, the security protocols on those specific accounts were disabled. Almost as if someone with master access wanted her to succeed. Sarah looked out at the bay, watching a ferry cut through the blue water. Richard was sloppy with his passwords, Sarah said vaguely. He used the same one for everything. Stock price of his first company. Yes, 122488, Mark nodded. We know. But the master access override required a secondary authentication, a physical key fob. Richard kept his on his keychain. He also kept a spare in his desk drawer at home, Sarah said, under the scotch. Mark stared at her. The realization slowly dawned on him. You knew, Mark whispered. You knew Jessica was stealing from him, and you let her do it. Sarah turned back to him, her expression serene. Richard used money to control people, Mark. He used it to control me, and he used it to buy Jessica. I knew that as long as Jessica felt she was winning financially, she would stay loyal to him. But I needed her greedy. I needed her hungry. I needed her to get used to a lifestyle that Richard couldn't sustain once I froze the assets. Sarah smiled, a chilling echo of the smile she had given in the courtroom. I knew that when the money stopped, Jessica wouldn't stand by him. A mistress like that doesn't stick around for the bankruptcy hearings. By letting her steal a little cushion, I ensured that when the crash came, she would feel safe enough to turn on him to protect her nest egg. I didn't just want Richard broke. I wanted him alone. I wanted him to know that the woman he betrayed me for sold him out for 20 grand a month. Mark Simmons, a man who had seen every type of financial crime imaginable, looked at Sarah with a mixture of fear and profound respect. She hadn't just played the victim. She had engineered the entire collapse from the inside out. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Ms. Sterling, Mark said dryly. It's Ms. Miller now, Sarah corrected. The glass door to the terrace slid open. Daniel walked out. He looked healthier, happier. He was wearing a decent shirt and carrying architectural blueprints. Hey, Mom, Daniel said. The architects are ready for us down at the Skyline site. They want to discuss the lobby design. I was thinking we should scrap Richard's gold statue idea and put in a community green space instead. Sarah stood up, placing a hand on her son's arm. She looked at the blueprints, the future of a $50 million building that belonged to the boy Richard had thrown away. That sounds perfect, Daniel, Sarah said. Let's go build something real. Richard Sterling sat in his dingy apartment, the television flickering with the evening news. The anchor was talking about the grand opening of the Miller Tower, formerly the Skyline Project, and its new young owner, Daniel Miller, who was donating a portion of the retail space to a non-profit for at-risk youth. On the screen, Sarah stood next to Daniel, cutting a ribbon. She looked radiant, powerful, and completely untouchable. Richard looked down at his dinner, a microwave burrito on a paper plate. He remembered the nights at Le Cavalier, the $500 bottles of wine, the feeling of being a god among men. A laugh bubbled up in his chest. But it wasn't the booming, confident bark of the man who owned Seattle. It was a dry, wheezing sound that turned into a racking cough. He was alone in the dark, and the silence was deafening. He had laughed when she filed alone. Sarah Miller got the last laugh. What a ride. Sarah didn't just win a divorce case. She executed a masterclass in long-game revenge. It just goes to show, never underestimate the quiet ones, and never assume you're the smartest person in the room just because you're the loudest. Richard Sterling learned that lesson the hard way, losing his fortune, his freedom, and his legacy to the wife he ignored and the son he rejected. If you enjoyed this story of ultimate karma, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And subscribe so you don't miss the next epic tale of justice served cold. Thanks for watching. They say money can't buy happiness, but the lack of it can certainly buy you a whole lot of misery. Richard thought he held all the cards. He thought his high-priced lawyers, his offshore accounts, and his family's cruel legacy were enough to crush the woman who had devoted 10 years of her life to him. He told her she was worthless. He told her she would leave with nothing but the clothes on her back. He was right about one thing. The marriage was over. But he was dead wrong about who held the power. Because when the courtroom doors opened and her poor uncle walked in, Richard didn't just lose his confidence. He realized he had been playing a game he never understood. This is the story of how the underdog didn't just bite back. She swallowed the predator whole. The champagne in the crystal flute had gone flat. Elena stared at the bubbles, or rather, the lack of them. Across the table, sitting in the best booth at Le Bernardin in Midtown Manhattan, Richard Sterling checked his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. "Are you going to drink that, or just interrogate it?" Richard asked, his voice smooth, but laced with that familiar impatience. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit. He looked every inch the tech mogul he was, handsome in a sharp, predatory way. "Happy anniversary, Richard," Elena said softly, raising her glass. 10 years. Richard didn't raise his. He placed his hands flat on the white tablecloth. The diamond ring on his pinky finger caught the ambient light. "Elena, we need to talk, and I don't want a scene. God knows my mother warned me you were emotional." Elena's stomach dropped. "A scene? We're at dinner. What's going on?" Richard signaled the waiter, not for more wine, but for the check. He hadn't even ordered food yet. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the table. It hit the centerpiece with a dull thud. "I'm filing, Eleanor. Tomorrow morning. My lawyers at Bradford & Associates have already drawn up the paperwork. This is just a courtesy copy, so you're not blindsided by the process server at the charity gala on Thursday." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The noise of the restaurant, the clinking silverware, the hushed conversations of New York's elite seemed to vanish, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. "Divorce?" she whispered. "But we just bought the estate in Greenwich. We were talking about nothing," Richard cut her off, his eyes cold. "I was talking. You were listening. That's how this marriage has always worked. Look, let's be adults. You're 32. You're still attractive. You'll find some mid-level manager to take care of you. But as for the life you're living now, it's over." Elena reached for the envelope, her hand trembling. "Is there someone else?" Richard laughed, a short, cruel bark. "There's always someone else, Elena. Her name is Camilla. She's 24. She's a partner's daughter at the firm, and frankly, she understands the industry. You were a charity case. A waitress I picked up because I thought you looked sweet. But sweet doesn't help me close mergers." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a serpentine hiss. "I know you. You're going to run to a lawyer. Don't bother. You signed a prenup the day before the wedding. You remember, you were so in love you didn't even read it, You get nothing. No alimony, no access to the Sterling Trust. You get the car, the 2018 Mercedes, and your personal effects. That's it. I helped you build Sterling Logistics, Elena said, her voice shaking but gaining a sudden edge. I worked the phones when we had no staff. I designed the branding. I hosted every dinner that got you those investors. You were a glorified hostess, Richard spat. And now, you're fired. He stood up, throwing a $500 bill onto the table. Don't come back to the penthouse tonight. I've had the locks changed. Your things are in storage. My assistant, Jessica, will text you the unit number. He walked away. He didn't look back. Elena sat alone in the center of one of the most expensive restaurants in the world, the envelope clutching in her hand like a lifeline, or perhaps a death sentence. She opened it. The language was brutal, irreconcilable differences. Plaintiff retains sole ownership of real estate holdings located at... She wasn't crying. That was the strangest part. The shock had frozen her tears. She walked out of the restaurant into the humid New York night. She hailed a cab, not to the penthouse she couldn't enter, but to a cheap hotel in Queens, where she knew she could pay cash. Sitting on the lumpy mattress, she pulled out her phone. She scrolled past the contacts of friends, who she knew would drop her the second the news broke. She scrolled all the way down to a number she hadn't called in 12 years. Uncle Marcus. Richard knew about Uncle Marcus. He used to make fun of him. The crazy old hermit living in a shack in Montana, Richard called him. Elena had told Richard that Marcus was a retired history teacher who lost his pension. That was the lie she told everyone to protect Marcus's privacy. But Richard didn't know the truth. Nobody did. She pressed call. It rang once. Ellie? A gruff, gravelly voice answered. He did it, Uncle Marcus, Elena said, her voice finally breaking. He served me the papers. He took everything. He says I'm leaving with nothing. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the sound of a match striking and the exhale of smoke. He said that, did he? Marcus asked, his voice dangerously calm. Richard Sterling thinks he's a shark because he swims in a pool. He's about to find out what lives in the ocean. Dry your eyes, Ellie. I'm coming to New York. 3 days later, the reality of Elena's situation had set in. She was staying in a Motel 6 near JFK Airport to save money. Richard had frozen the joint checking account, which was illegal, but Richard knew she didn't have the funds to fight an emergency motion immediately. She had a meeting scheduled with Richard's legal team. They had demanded she come to their offices to sign the surrender, as Richard had arrogantly texted her. The offices of Bradford & Associates were located on the 45th floor of a glass tower in Hudson Yards. The view cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Elena walked into the conference room, wearing a simple black dress. She looked tired, but she held her head high. Richard was there, sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. Next to him was a woman Elena recognized instantly, Camilla. She was blonde, sharp-featured, and wearing a diamond necklace Elena had seen in Richard's safe last month. On Richard's right sat his lead attorney, Harrison Thorne. Thorne was legendary in New York. They called him the Butcher of Broadway. He charged $1,500 an hour and had never lost a high-profile divorce case. Sit down, Elena, Thorne said, not looking up from his files. Let's make this quick. We have a settlement offer. It's generous, considering the prenup implies zero liability. Elena sat. She felt small in the oversized leather chair. I haven't had a chance to hire counsel yet. And with what money? Camilla chimed in, smirking. Richard says you're overdrawn. Richard chuckled. Camilla, please, let the adult speak. He looked at Elena. Here's the deal. You sign the uncontested divorce papers today. You admit to marital infidelity. What? Elena stood up, slamming her hand on the table. I never cheated on you. You're the one sitting next to your mistress. Sit down, Thorne barked. His voice boomed through the room. We have affidavits from 3 separate staff members claiming they saw you entertaining men at the Greenwich estate. Are they true? Doesn't matter. We can drag this out in court for 5 years. We will drain you, bury you in legal fees, and ruin your reputation. Or you sign this. You admit fault. We give you a lump sum of $50,000 to start your new, whatever life you're going to have. Elena looked at Richard. His eyes were dead. He was enjoying this. He was destroying her just to see if she would break. You built your company on my family's connections, Elena said quietly. Your family? Richard laughed loudly. Your dead parents? Your uncle who lives in a cabin and eats beans out of a can? Elena, please. I built Sterling Logistics. Me. My genius. Now sign the papers. The door to the conference room opened. Everyone turned. The receptionist looked flustered. Sir, I told him he couldn't come in. But he... A man walked in. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, worn-out jeans, and heavy work boots that left a faint trail of mud on the pristine carpet. He had a grey beard that looked like steel wool, and eyes that were dark, intelligent, and furious. He carried a battered leather briefcase that looked older than everyone in the room. It was Uncle Marcus. Richard burst out laughing. Oh, this is rich. This is the cavalry. The hillbilly uncle. Camilla covered her nose theatrically. Does he smell like manure? Marcus didn't look at them. He walked straight to Elena. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. You okay, kid? I'm okay, Uncle Marcus, she whispered. But we shouldn't be here. They have sharks. Marcus turned to look at Richard. For the first time, Richard stopped laughing. There was something in Marcus's posture, a military rigidness, a terrifying calmness that didn't fit the crazy uncle narrative. Sir, Marcus said, his voice filling the room without shouting. You're the man who thinks he can throw my niece away like garbage. Get out, Thorne stood up. I'm calling security. You're trespassing. I don't think so, Marcus said. He tossed the battered briefcase onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy metallic thud, heavier than paper should sound. I'm here to represent my niece as her counsel. You, Thorne sneered. You're a lawyer? In what state? The state of delusion? Marcus slowly undid the buckles of the briefcase. I passed the New York bar in 1985, Mr. Thorne. Before you were even out of diapers. I haven't practiced in a long time, because I haven't had to. But for this? Marcus opened the case. He pulled out a single, thin blue folder and slid it toward Thorne. I suggest you look at that before you call security, unless you want the SEC raiding this building in about 20 minutes. Richard frowned. What is he talking about? Who is this old fool? Thorne opened the blue folder. His face, usually a mask of arrogance, went pale. He adjusted his glasses. He read the first page, then the second. He looked up at Marcus, his mouth slightly open. This is a deed of trust, Thorne stammered. Keep reading, Marcus said, pulling a chair out and sitting down, putting his muddy boots up on the edge of the table, right next to Richard's hand. Richard, Thorne whispered, his voice trembling. Did you verify the initial seed funding for Sterling Logistics back in 2014? Of course, Richard scoffed. It came from the Vanguard Shadow Group, an angel investor. And who owns Vanguard Shadow Group? Marcus asked. He pulled a cigar out of his pocket and bit the end off, spitting it on the floor. Richard looked confused. "It's a blind trust. I don't know the principal. It doesn't matter." "It matters," Marcus said, lighting the cigar despite the no smoking signs, "because Vanguard Shadow Group is a holding company." Marcus pointed the lit cigar at Elena. "Solely owned by the Vance Family Trust. Specifically, her." The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "That's a lie," Richard whispered. "She's broke." "She thinks she's broke because her father wanted her to find a man who loved her for her, not her money," Marcus said. "So he put it all in a trust that activates upon her 35th birthday, or in the event of a significant legal distress where her assets are threatened." Marcus smiled, and it was a wolf's smile. "You didn't just divorce your wife, Richard. You just declared war on your boss." The silence in the conference room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a bomb blast. Harrison Thorne, the butcher of Broadway, was sweating. A single bead of perspiration rolled down his temple, bypassing his expensive horn-rimmed glasses, and dripped onto the blue folder. "Harrison," Richard demanded, his voice cracking. "Tell him he's lying. Tell him the Vanguard Shadow Group is just some shell company in the Caymans. I own Sterling Logistics. I own 51% of the voting stock." Thorne didn't look up. He was reading page 4 of the document, his eyes darting back and forth rapidly. He finally looked up, taking off his glasses. He looked aged, defeated. "You own 51% of the Class B stock, Richard," Thorne said quietly. "Common stock. Operational rights. So that's control." "Not according to the initial angel investor agreement you signed in 2014, Marcus interjected, puffing on his cigar. Smoke curled around the expensive light fixtures. "You were so eager to get that $10 million to start the company, you didn't read the fine print on the capital structure. Typical narcissist behavior. You saw the zeros, not the strings." Marcus stood up and walked around the table, stopping behind Richard's chair. He leaned down, whispering into Richard's ear. "The Vanguard Shadow Group holds 100% of the Class A preferred stock, and that stock comes with a special little provision called the Fidelity and Moral Turpitude Clause. Do you want me to read it to you, Richie, or should your lawyer do the honors?" Richard spun his chair around to face Thorne. "Read it." Thorne cleared his throat, his hands shaking slightly. It says, "In the event that the principal operator, Richard Sterling, engages in conduct that dissolves the marital union with the primary beneficiary, Elena Sterling, due to infidelity, abuse, or abandonment, the Class A preferred stock converts immediately into controlling voting shares at a ratio of 10-1. Thorne looked at Richard with pity. "Richard, if this document is valid, you don't own 51% of the company anymore. You own about 4%, and Vanguard, meaning Elena, owns the rest." "This is entrapment!" Richard screamed, leaping to his feet. He swept the crystal water pitcher off the table. It shattered against the wall, sending glass skittering across the floor. "You tricked me. You set me up 10 years ago." "We didn't set you up," Elena spoke. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was steady, cold, and resonating with a sudden realization of power. She stood up, smoothing down her black dress. "My father set this up. He knew men like you existed. He knew someone might try to marry me for the inheritance I didn't even know I had. He built a safety net, and you just walked right into it." Camilla, who had been silent, suddenly shifted in her chair. The smirk was gone. She looked from Richard to the shattered glass, then to Elena. "Wait," Camilla said, her voice shrill. "If he loses the controlling interest, does he still have access to the corporate accounts? The penthouse? The jet?" Marcus laughed, a dry, harsh sound. "Miss Camilla, is it? As of 5 minutes ago, Richard is technically an employee, under review by the majority shareholder. He doesn't have access to the corporate coffee machine, let alone the jet." Richard turned on Marcus, his face purple with rage. "I'll fight this, I'll sue. I'll drag this through probate court for a decade. You think a piece of paper scares me?" Marcus moved faster than a man his age should. He stepped forward, his face inches from Richard's. "It's not just a piece of paper, son. It's a foreclosure. See, the loan Vanguard gave you? It's callable. Immediately. That's $10 million plus 10 years of accrued interest at 8%. That's roughly $21 million. Marcus checked his cheap plastic watch. "You have until close of business today to repay the principal loan. If not, the trust seizes all personal assets pledged as collateral." Marcus picked up the papers Richard had originally served Eleanor. He glanced at the list of assets Richard had bragged about: the house, the cars, the investments. "And look at that," Marcus smiled. "You listed all your personal assets right here in the divorce filing. Thanks for the inventory." "Richard, saves us the trouble of hiring a forensic accountant." Richard collapsed back into his chair. He looked at Thorne. "Harrison, do something." Thorne closed his briefcase. "I can't, Richard. The contract is ironclad. If I fight this, I'm arguing against a document signed, notarized, and filed with the SEC 10 years ago. I'd be disbarred for filing a frivolous defense." Thorne stood up. "Eleanor, Mr. Marcus, it seems my client needs time to consider his position. I recommend we adjourn." "We're not adjourning," Eleanor said. She walked over to the head of the table, Richard's spot. She looked down at him. "You gave me an hour to move out of the penthouse. I'm giving you 30 minutes to vacate the building. Security will escort you." "You can't do this," Richard whispered. "I built this company." "And you tried to destroy the person who helped you build it," Elena said. "Get out!" Camilla stood up abruptly. She grabbed her Chanel bag. "Camilla?" Richard looked up. "Where are you going?" "I have a meeting," she muttered, not making eye contact. "I can't be involved in this, Richard. It's bad for my career." She walked out without looking back. Richard was left alone at the table, surrounded by his high-priced lawyer who couldn't save him, the wife he had underestimated, and the uncle he had mocked. Marcus tipped his imaginary hat. "Nice suit, Richie. Hope you kept the receipt." The adrenaline crash hit Elena about an hour later. They were sitting in a diner 3 blocks away from the glass tower. It was a greasy spoon, called Sal's, the kind of place with red vinyl seats that were cracked and duct-taped, and the smell of bacon grease permanently etched into the walls. It was a stark contrast to Le Bernardin, but to Elena, it felt like a palace. She stared at her coffee cup, her hands shaking slightly. "Eat your eggs, Ellie," Marcus said gently. He was digging into a stack of pancakes like a man who hadn't eaten in days. "Uncle Marcus," Elena said, looking up at him. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years, I thought we were struggling. I thought Dad died broke. I sent you money for heating oil last winter." Marcus sighed. He put down his fork and wiped his mouth with a paper napkin. The playfulness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "Your dad, my brother, he was a brilliant man, Ellie. But he was paranoid. He made his money in logistics software in the 90s, right before the boom. But he saw what money did to people. It made them targets. When he got sick, he made me promise. Promise what? That I wouldn't let the money ruin you. He wanted you to build your own character, to find a path that wasn't paved with gold. He wanted you to find a partner who loved Elena, not the heiress. Marcus reached across the table and squeezed her hand. When you brought Richard home, I knew. I saw the way he looked at the furniture, not you. I saw how he asked about the property values before he asked about your childhood. I told your dad's lawyers to activate the sleeping protocol. We funded him through the shell company to keep him close, to keep him dependent on the trust, even if he didn't know it. We gave him the rope, Ellie. We just had to wait to see if he'd hang himself with it. He did, Elena whispered. He really did. He's not done, though, Marcus warned, his voice hardening. Men like Richard Sterling don't just roll over. He's cornered. A cornered rat is more dangerous than a lion. He's going to try something desperate. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit back office of a private club in the financial district, Richard was indeed desperate. He was pacing back and forth, a glass of scotch in his hand. Harrison Thorne had abandoned him, citing a conflict of interest now that the company ownership was in dispute. Richard was alone, but he wasn't out of moves yet. He pulled out his burner phone. He dialed a number he had saved under plumber. "It's me," Richard said when the line clicked open. "I have a situation." "I don't do situations anymore, Mr. Sterling," a raspy voice replied. "I'm retired." "I'll pay double," Richard hissed. "I need a cleaner, not for a person, for a server." "Digital?" "Yes, the Sterling Logistics mainframe. There are discrepancies in the offshore accounts. If the new majority shareholders get access to the books, they'll see where I've been skimming the profits." This was the secret Richard had been guarding for 5 years. He hadn't just been running the company. He had been siphoning millions into accounts in the Cook Islands, preparing for the day he would dump Elena and flee with a golden parachute. But he hadn't expected to be locked out of the building so fast. "If they audit the books," Richard said, sweat dripping down his nose, "I'm not just broke, I'm going to federal prison." "Accessing a secured server remotely without credentials? That's expensive," the voice said. "Name your price." 50,000. Crypto only. Up front. Richard checked his crypto wallet on his phone. He had just enough. "Done. I need you to wipe the transaction logs from 2020 to present. Make it look like a corruption error. Consider it done within the hour." Richard hung up and chugged the scotch. He felt a glimmer of hope returning. If he could erase the evidence of the embezzlement, he could sue Elena for wrongful termination. He could claim the trust documents were forged. He just needed to survive the next 24 hours. He walked out of the club, squinting in the sunlight. He needed an ally. Camilla had bailed, but he knew her weakness: ambition. He hailed a cab to Camilla's apartment. He banged on the door until she opened it, looking annoyed, wearing a silk robe. "Go away, Richard. You're radioactive." "I'm not done, Camilla." He pushed past her into the apartment. "Listen to me. The old man, the uncle, he's a fraud." "He seemed pretty real to me." He had Thorne shaking. "He's an actor," Richard lied, his mind racing, inventing a narrative. "I looked him up. Marcus Vance was disbarred in 1999 for jury tampering. That's why he hasn't practiced. He's not a lawyer. If he represented Elena in that room, anything he served me is void. Procedural error." Camilla's eyes narrowed. She was a lawyer, and she knew that wasn't exactly how it worked, but she smelled an angle. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive," Richard lied again. "But I need someone on the inside to file the motion. Thorne won't do it. You have to." "Me?" Camilla laughed. "I'm a junior associate." "If you save my company," Richard grabbed her shoulders, "I will make you a partner. I will give you 10% of the stock. We can destroy them, Camilla. Elena is weak. She doesn't have the stomach for a war. We hit them hard, fast and dirty. We challenge the uncle's credentials. We freeze the trust." Camilla looked at him. She saw the desperation, but she also saw the opportunity. If Richard was right, she could bypass 20 years of climbing the corporate ladder. 10%, she said slowly. "And the Greenwich House." "Done," Richard said. "Okay." Camilla walked to her desk and opened her laptop. "Let's see if Uncle Marcus really is who he says he is." Back at the diner, Marcus's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and frowned. "What is it?" Elena asked. "Security at the tower," Marcus said. "They just flagged an unauthorized remote login attempt on the mainframe. Someone is trying to wipe the servers." Elena's eyes went wide. "Richard." "He's trying to hide the bodies." Marcus stood up, throwing a $20 bill on the table. "We need to get to the server room. Physically. If he deletes those logs, we can't prove he embezzled. And if we can't prove he embezzled, he might wiggle out of the moral turpitude clause by claiming the divorce is just a difference of opinion." "He's doubling down," Elena realized. "He's betting it all on black," Marcus said, putting his hat on. "Let's go spin the wheel." The cab ride back to the Hudson Yards Tower was excruciating. Every red light felt like a personal insult. Marcus was on the phone the entire time, barking orders to someone Eleanor didn't know existed. "Yeah, lock it down. I don't care if you have to pull the power cord out of the wall. Just kill the connection. No, I authorize it. Code, Bluebird 07. He hung up and looked at Elena. "My guy in IT is trying to firewall the intrusion, but whoever Richard hired is good. They're bouncing the signal through servers in Russia and Brazil. It's a wiper virus. It doesn't just delete data. It overwrites it with garbage code so it can't be recovered." "Why would he do that?" Eleanor asked, gripping the door handle. "If he destroys the company records, he destroys the company's value." "He doesn't care about the value anymore," Marcus said grimly. "He knows he's lost ownership. Now he's just trying to stay out of jail. If we can't prove he stole from the company, he walks away free. And knowing Richard, he's probably got millions stashed away that we don't know about." They arrived at the tower. The security guards in the lobby, who had ignored Elena for years or treated her with polite indifference, now snapped to attention. "Mrs. Sterling," the head guard nodded. "Mr. Vance, we have the elevators held for you." "Server room, 40th floor," Marcus commanded. They shot up the building. The elevator doors opened to a chaotic scene. The IT department, usually a quiet hum of activity, was in a panic. Monitors were flashing red warning signs. A young man with messy hair and thick glasses ran up to them. "Mr. Vance, it's eating through the firewall. We've lost the 2021 financial logs already. It's going for 2022 and 2023 now." "Pull the hard drives," Marcus yelled. "We can't. They're hot-swappable RAID arrays. If we pull them while they're writing, we corrupt the data anyway." Elena looked at the screens. Lines of code were scrolling by too fast to read. She saw the progress bar. Wipe complete, 35%. "Wait," Elena said. She stepped forward, staring at the screen. Richard Richard is predictable. What do you mean? Marcus asked. He uses the same password for everything, Elena said, but he thinks he's clever. He changes the case. Is there a master override? Yes, the IT guy said. But we need the admin root password. Richard was the only one who had it. Try Midas Touch, Elena said. Capital M, capital T, followed by his birth year. 1980. The IT guy typed furiously. Access denied. Try it backwards, Elena said, her eyes narrowing as she remembered a conversation from years ago where Richard bragged about being the Sadim. Midas backwards. Touch Midas 1980. The IT guy typed it. Access denied. We're at 60%, the technician yelled. It's hitting the payroll accounts. Elena closed her eyes. She thought about Richard, his ego, his obsession. What was the one thing he loved more than money? Try Elena is nothing, she whispered. The room went silent. The technician looked at her, hesitant. Type it, she shouted. Capital E, capital I, capital N. He typed it. Enter. The screen froze. The red flashing lights turned green. A message popped up. Admin override accepted. Terminating remote connection. The wiping stopped. We got it, the technician breathed, slumping back in his chair. We saved the last 3 years of data. The embezzlement logs, they're still there. Marcus put a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. He really hated you that much? No, Elena said, staring at the screen where her name had been used as the key to his kingdom. He just needed to remind himself every day that he was the one in control. It was his mantra. She turned to Marcus. Print everything, every transaction, every email. We're not just divorcing him, Uncle Marcus. We're burying him. While Elena was saving the company, Richard was busy trying to destroy her reputation. He sat in Camilla's apartment, watching the upload bar on his own laptop. But this wasn't a virus. It was a video. Are you sure about this? Camilla asked, biting her lip. She was pacing the small living room. This is defamation, Richard. If it's not true... It doesn't have to be true, Richard snapped. It just has to be viral. The court of public opinion moves faster than the court of law. If I can paint Elena as mentally unstable, as a gold digger who manipulated a senile uncle into forging documents, the judge will pause the proceedings. It buys us time. He hit publish. The video went live on a popular gossip channel on YouTube, titled The Truth About Eleanor Sterling, Blackmail, Lies, and the Mystery Uncle. In the video, Richard, looking disheveled and teary-eyed, spoke directly to the camera. I built Sterling Logistics from nothing, he lied smoothly. My wife, she was always troubled. I tried to help her. I paid for her therapy. But when I told her I couldn't support her extravagant lifestyle anymore, she snapped. She brought in a man she claims is her uncle. A man with a criminal record. They forged documents to steal my company. I am the victim here. Please don't let them destroy an American success story. Within an hour, the video had 50,000 views. Then 100,000 comments poured in. She sounds crazy. Stay strong, King. Gold diggers are the worst. Elena's phone began to blow up. Reporters were calling. Friends who had ignored her were now texting, asking for the tea. She sat in the executive office of the tower, Richard's old office. She watched the video on the giant screen. He's good, Marcus admitted, watching Richard cry on screen. That single tear? Oscar-worthy. People believe him, Elena said, her voice hollow. Look at the comments. They hate me. They hate the character he created, Marcus corrected. Now we have to show them who he really is. How? We have the financial records now, Marcus said. We know he stole $5 million last year alone. We can go to the police. No, Elena said firmly. Police takes too long. An investigation takes months. By then, he'll have spun this narrative so tight I'll never get out of it. We need to beat him at his own game. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Uncle Marcus, you said you were a history teacher. Before I was a lawyer, yes. What happens to a tyrant when the people realize he's weak? They tear him apart, Marcus said. Exactly, Elena turned around. He wants a public spectacle. Let's give him one. He's hosting the Global Tech Summit tomorrow night, isn't he? He's the keynote speaker. It's his big moment to shine in front of investors. He'll still go, Marcus nodded. His ego won't let him cancel. He thinks he's winning the PR war. Then we're going to the summit, Elena said, and we're not going alone. The next evening, the Global Tech Summit was in full swing at the Javits Center. It was a glittering affair of black ties and evening gowns. Richard walked the red carpet, Camilla on his arm. He looked triumphant. The video had done its work. People were patting him on the back, offering condolences about his crazy wife. You're handling this with such grace, Richard, a major investor told him. It's hard, Richard sighed theatrically. But the truth always wins. He took the stage to thunderous applause. A giant screen behind him displayed the Sterling Logistics logo. Thank you, Richard said, adjusting the microphone. Tonight, I want to talk about vision, about seeing the future when others only see the past. Suddenly, the lights in the auditorium flickered. The giant screen behind him went black. The microphone squealed with feedback. Technical difficulties? Richard joked nervously. Looks like we need better IT. The screen flickered back to life. But it wasn't the Sterling logo anymore. It was a video. Grainy, black and white, footage. It was from a security camera. It showed Richard in his office. He was on the phone. The audio boomed through the speakers. I don't care about the safety regulations. Richard's voice on the recording was clear. Cut the maintenance budget on the fleet. If the trucks break down, that's the driver's problem. I need that extra 2% margin for my bonus. Just cook the books, Harrison. The audience gasped. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard froze. Turn it off, he yelled at the sound booth. This is a deep fake. It's AI. The video cut to another clip. This one was recent. It was from the hidden camera in the conference room at Bradford & Associates, recorded just 2 days ago. She was a charity case, a waitress I picked up. You get nothing. No alimony. Then the coup de grace, a split screen showing the bank transfer logs Elena and the IT team had recovered. Transfer, $500,000 to account 8890, Cayman Islands. User Richard Sterling. Transfer, $200,000 to account 8890, Cayman Islands. User Richard Sterling. The numbers scrolled faster and faster, totaling millions. Richard stood on stage, bathed in the light of his own corruption. He looked small. He looked terrified. From the back of the auditorium, the double doors swung open. Elena walked in. She wasn't wearing black this time. She was wearing a stunning, blood-red dress that looked like armor. Uncle Marcus was beside her, looking clean-shaven and wearing a sharp tuxedo. And behind them, 2 federal agents with FBI emblazoned on their jackets. Elena walked right down the center aisle. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. She stopped at the foot of the stage. Richard gripped the podium. "Elena, we can talk about this." "We're done talking, Richard," she said, her voice amplified by the silence of the room. "You wanted everyone to know the truth? Here it is." She pointed to the screen. "You didn't build this company. You stole from it. You didn't support me. You used me, and now—" She looked at the FBI agents. "He's all yours." The flashbulbs were blinding. As the FBI agents ascended the stage, the crowd at the Javits Center didn't flee. They pulled out their phones. Richard Sterling, the man who had been on the cover of Forbes just a month ago, was now the star of 1,000 Instagram live streams documenting his downfall. "Richard Sterling," the lead agent said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and securities fraud." Richard backed away, knocking over the podium. "You can't touch me! Do you know who I am? Harrison! Call Harrison!" But Harrison Thorne was nowhere to be seen. He had quietly slipped out the back exit the moment the video started playing, likely already drafting a press release distancing his firm from the Sterling name. The only person left on stage with Richard was Camilla. She stood frozen, clutching her Chanel bag like a shield. Richard grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Tell them, Camilla. Tell them this is a mistake. You're my witness." Camilla looked at Richard's desperate, sweating face. Then she looked at the agents, and finally, down at Elena, standing in the front row in that blood-red dress. Camilla pulled her arm free with a violent jerk. "Don't touch me," she hissed, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "What?" Richard blinked, stunned. Camilla turned to the agents. "I have the hard drive," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "The backup he told me to hide in my apartment. It has the unencrypted logs. I'm cooperating." Richard's face went slack. You rat. I made you." "You promised me a partnership," Camilla spat back, tears of anger in her eyes. "But you were going to frame me, weren't you? If the FBI came knocking, you were going to say I cooked the books to impress you. I saw the emails on your laptop, Richard. You were setting me up as the fall guy." The crowd gasped. The betrayal was absolute. "That's a lie!" Richard screamed as the agents cuffed him. He was dragged off the stage, kicking and shouting obscenities, a stark contrast to the visionary who had stood there 5 minutes ago. Elena didn't smile. She just watched him go. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like taking out the trash, necessary, smelly, but ultimately a relief. 3 weeks later, Elena sat in a visitor's room at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. The room was cold, smelling of industrial cleaner and misery. Richard was brought in. He looked terrible. The bespoke suits were replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He hadn't shaved, and his eyes were bloodshot. He sat down, chains rattling. He looked at Elena through the plexiglass. "You look good," he muttered, his voice raspy. "I am good," Elena said softly. "You came to gloat?" Richard sneered, though it lacked his usual bite. "To see the mighty fallen?" "No," Elena said. "I came to bring you this." She slid a single piece of paper into the transfer drawer. Richard picked it up. It was a check for $50,000. "What is this?" he asked, confused. "It's the settlement you offered me," Elena said. "You remember, in the conference room. You said 50,000 was enough to start a new life." Richard stared at the check. His hands started to shake. "I'm selling the company, Richard," she continued. "I'm liquidating Sterling Logistics. The board voted this morning. We're selling the assets to a competitor. The brand Sterling is toxic now. It's worth nothing." You can't kill my legacy," he whispered. Your legacy is a prison sentence, Eleanor said, standing up. I'm taking my share, my family's money, and I'm starting a foundation for financial literacy, to teach women how to protect themselves from men like you. Richard slammed his hand against the glass. I made you. You were nothing without me. Eleanor leaned in close to the glass. That's where you were always wrong, Richard. I was the one holding you up. You just never looked down to notice. She turned to leave. Wait, Richard called out, panic rising in his voice. Elena, please, I can't do this. I'm not built for this place. Help me, talk to the judge, please. Elena paused at the door. She looked back at the man she had wasted 10 years on. I'd love to help Richard, she said, but my uncle advises against it, and I've learned to always listen to my uncle. The heavy steel door clanged shut, leaving Richard alone with his $50,000. Check. Money he couldn't spend where he was going. 6 months later. The snow was falling softly on the mountains of Montana. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. Elena sat on the porch of Uncle Marcus's cabin, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, holding a mug of hot cocoa. It was a stark contrast to the penthouse in Manhattan, and she had never been happier. The divorce was finalized. Richard had pleaded guilty to avoid a 20-year sentence. He got 8 years in minimum security. Camilla had lost her law license, but avoided jail time by testifying against him. Elena took a deep breath. The silence here was healing. The front door opened, and Uncle Marcus stepped out. He was back in his flannel shirt and worn jeans, looking like he belonged on a tractor, not in a boardroom. Cold out here, Ellie, he said, sitting in the rocking chair next to her. I like it, she smiled. It feels real. Dunno, Marcus said, lighting his pipe. The sale of the company closed today. The funds hit the trust account. How much? Elena asked. She hadn't even checked. After paying off the creditors, the lawyers, and settling the lawsuits Richard caused, you cleared about 40 million. Elena nodded. It was a staggering amount of money. But after the war she had just fought, it felt like just numbers. I'm going to donate half, she said. Good girl. Marcus nodded approvingly. But, there's something else we need to talk about. Something your dad and I never told you. Elena turned to him. What is it? No more secrets, Uncle Marcus. Well, it's about this place. Marcus gestured to the humble wooden cabin behind them. And me being a poor, retired teacher. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Not house keys. They looked like keys to a heavy vehicle. Your dad was the software genius, Marcus said, looking out at the snowy peaks. But I was the one who bought the land. I didn't just lose my pension, Ellie. I cashed it out in the 80s and bought land. A lot of land. When nobody wanted it. He pointed to the mountain range in the distance. You see that peak? The one with the cloud touching it? Yeah? That's the edge of the property line. Elena's jaw dropped. What? You own the mountain? I own 40,000 acres, Marcus chuckled, and the mineral rights below it, and the water rights. I'm not a hermit because I'm broke, Ellie. I'm a hermit because I'm tired of people asking me for money. I'm worth about 3 times what Richard Sterling thought he was worth. Elena stared at him. The man in the flannel shirt. The man Richard had mocked as a hillbilly. Why didn't you help me sooner? She asked. If you had all this money. Because you didn't need money, Marcus said seriously. You needed strength. If I had bailed you out the first time Richard made you cry, you wouldn't be the woman sitting here today. You wouldn't be the woman who walked into that gala and took down a tyrant. He tossed the keys to her. What are these? She asked. Keys to the hangar. Marcus grinned. My private plane is fueled up. Not a corporate jet. A vintage P-51 Mustang. I thought maybe we could go for a ride. Show you your new kingdom. Elena looked at the keys, then at her uncle. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they were happy tears. You're a tricky old man, Marcus Vance. I'm a lawyer, he winked. Tricky is the job description. Eleanor stood up. The nightmare of New York felt 1,000,000 miles away. She wasn't Mrs. Sterling anymore. She wasn't the victim. She was Elena Vance, heiress to a mountain, destroyer of a fraud, and for the first time in her life, completely, utterly free. Let's go fly, she said. As they walked toward the barn where Marcus kept his secrets, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the vast, wild country that belonged to them. Richard had warned her she would lose everything. In the end, she had lost nothing but a dead weight and gained the world. And that is how Elena turned the tables on the man who thought he could discard her like trash. It's a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't just about what's in your bank account. It's about who is in your corner. Richard underestimated the quiet man in the flannel shirt, and he paid the ultimate price for his arrogance. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more dramatic stories about karma, betrayal, and sweet revenge, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. What would you have done if you were Elena? Would you have visited Richard in jail, or just let him rot? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you in the next story.